Before Canada became a land of hope for Black people, it was home to many who were held in slavery by French and British settlers, even some First Nations people. Millions of men and women and children from different West African societies were kidnapped and sold into slavery. They were traded for European goods such as guns and alcohol and iron. Captured Africans were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean by European traders to be sold again in the Caribbean, South America, or North America and forced to work for free. It is estimated that more than 4,000 Black men, women, and children were held in slavery in Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick between 1628 and 1834 when slavery was abolished. Enslaved Blacks were considered personal property. Settlers saw Black people as free labor they could use instead of paying European workers. Enslaved Blacks were bought and sold, hired out, and passed on to family members in wills. But it only took one voice to initiate change. Everything began to change in Canada on March 14, 1793, when Chloe Cooley, an enslaved Black woman in what is now called southwestern Ontario, was tied up and sold to a new American owner to be sent by boat across the river. She screamed and struggled, attracting the attention of witnesses, including Peter Martin, a free Black man and a former soldier. He and another man told the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, and Attorney General John White what happened. They used the opportunity to introduce a law to get rid of slavery. But because more than half of Upper Canada's politicians enslaved Blacks or were slave-holding families, it seemed impossible to get rid of slavery completely. So they instituted an act in 1793 that limits slavery as a compromise. This new law did not immediately free Blacks who were enslaved, but it made it illegal to bring any more enslaved people into the province, and any Black person who entered Upper Canada was free. Slaves could continue to be traded within the province and sold out of the province. And those enslaved in that time remained enslaved unless their owners set them free. Children born into slavery after 1793 could be enslaved until they turned 25 years old, and their children would be born free. Owners also had to provide food and clothing for those newly freed. Simcoe's 1793 law made Upper Canada one of the first British territories to limit the number of Black people in bondage. Then in 1833, the British government passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which ended slavery in all British colonies. And when the act took effect on August 1st, 1834, which we call Emancipation Day, several million enslaved Africans in British colonies, including a small number in Canada, became free. On that spring day, thousands of people saw the beginning of the answer to prayer down by that river. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. After slavery was abolished, the problems did not go away. School segregation in Ontario predated Confederation. In many municipalities, amendments to the laws in the 1850s were used to force Black people to ask for segregated schools. Post Confederation, the only provinces to legislate Black segregated schools were Ontario and Nova Scotia. The majority of segregated schools were located in Essex and Kent counties, where black communities had been established during the Underground Railroad era. In areas with segregated education, courts denied black students access to white schools. In communities without segregated institutions, black students could be made to sit on separate benches. Trustees warned teachers in favor of integrating schools that they could be docked pay or fired for speaking out. Harrow was home to not just segregated schools, but also segregated restaurants, and the movie theater was for white persons only. Kingsville and Leamington had sundown laws. Historian Elsie Hardy Davis recalls that sundown laws meant black people had to be off the streets of the city by sundown. But it only took one voice to initiate change. Leonard Braithwaite, Canada's first black provincial legislature, discovered that laws permitting segregated schools were still on the books. And on February 4, 1964, Braithwaite, a liberal representing Etobicoke, discussed the issue during his first speech at Queen's Park. There has not been a need for such schools since before the beginning of the century, he told his fellow MPs. Those days have passed. And on March 12, the Minister of Education, Bill Davis, amended the Separate Schools Act to remove all references to segregated schools. The last segregated school to close was segregated school number 11 in Colchester South, Essex County, in 1964. Ain't that good news? It only takes one voice to initiate change. Around 1950, Black history began to be celebrated by the railroad porters within Toronto's Black community. The porters had learned of it on their travels to the United States. The Canadian Negro Women Association hosted Negro History Week and petitioned the city to create Black History Month in the 1950s. But it was not until Ontario's Black History Society was founded in 1978 and petitioned the city of Toronto to have February proclaimed Black History Month that the celebration started to make inroads into the entire community. In 1995, the Ontario Black History Society successfully lobbied the federal government to have February declared as Black History Month. In December 1995, the Parliament officially recognized February as Black History Month, following a motion introduced by the first Black Canadian woman elected to Parliament, the Honorable Jean Augustine. Black History Month is celebrated in February in the United States and Canada, while in Ireland, the Netherlands, and the UK it is observed in October. And though it was the Honorable Jean Augustine whose voice introduced the motion, she echoes the voices of all those who celebrated Black history before her. If we are willing to speak up, we would be amazed how many people will stand by and stand with us and offer their support. And sometimes that is all we need. Our special music, Stand By Me. The first recorded race riot in North America was on July 26, 1784 in Nova Scotia, when around 40 white loyalists went to a Black Baptist preacher's home. His name was Reverend David George, and they were armed with hooks and chains seized from ships. Reverend George was a preacher in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and he was baptizing white loyalists, which inflamed the racial tensions there. Despite the threats on his life, he continued to preach. The angry mob tore down the houses of 20 other free Black loyalists living on the church's property. The mob also attacked George, beating him senseless according to the Loyal Heritage Society. He eventually gave up the fight in Shelburne and escaped to Birchtown. The riots continued for 10 days and reportedly spread to Birchtown. A large complement of British soldiers and a naval frigate were eventually brought into town to maintain order. But it only takes one voice to initiate change, even at the risk of persecution. And Reverend George knew that his ultimate fate was in God's hands. So he placed his hands in God's. Precious Lord, take my hand. Or special music. Julia and Bob will join me in the telling of this portion of the story. The Nova Scotia into which Carrie Best and Viola Desmond were born was a society with ingrained prejudices about people of color. There were restrictions on where blacks could live or work, where they could get their hair cut or sit in movie theaters. Carrie and Viola were instrumental in bringing down these barriers. Their most famous challenge involved the color bar at the Roseland Theatre in New Glasgow. In 1941, Carrie Best chose to sit with her son in the lower section rather than in the balcony reserved for blacks. The manager told her to leave for disturbing the peace, and Carrie stood her ground. I can't see how we're disturbing anyone's peace, she said. We are waiting for the movie to start. The manager called the police and Carrie was arrested and fined. 5 years later, Viola Desmond experienced the same prejudice in the same theater. She was a businesswoman who operated the Desmond School of Beauty Culture in Halifax and who had a line of products she sold across the province. In 1946, on a business trip to Sydney, Viola's car broke down in New Glasgow. While waiting for her car to be repaired, she came to the same theater, Roseland. She didn't notice the ticket specified that it was for the balcony. So instead, she took a seat downstairs.
Hey, you can't sit here. You pe-
The usher said.
you people are to sit in the balcony.
I'll sit here.
Viola replied. The manager arrived. He explained the ground floor seats cost more than the balcony.
How much is it?
Viola asked.
You can't buy a main floor ticket.
The man had Viola taken to the police station where she was locked up overnight. The incident would end up in court, and Carrie Best did everything she could to publicize Viola Desmond's case. Carrie began the Clarion, one of the first black owned published newspapers in Nova Scotia. And in that and other newspapers on a regular radio show, Carrie Best was tireless in pointing out racial prejudices and injustices of all kinds. The Nova Scotia government repealed its segregation laws in 1954, and in 2010, Viola Desmond received an official pardon. It takes one voice to initiate change, and then another added to it creates a ripple effect and keeps the change going. Even if protests and court decisions don't work, we can be sure that there will be a judgment. So you better mind. Or special music, you better mind. In the early 1800s, Canada and the northern parts of the US gained a reputation for being a haven for the enslaved. with Canada having the code name Canaan. Seeking freedom, many enslaved peoples traveled secretly to Canada through a concealed network known as the Underground Railroad. Many churches and Quaker meeting houses became stations on the route to freedom. Windsor hosted several sites, but there were also sites in East Gwillimbury and parts of Chatham, parts of Upper Ontario. There was much mythology on how people communicated with each other between these stations. And since music and spirituals were often used in Black communities to counter the theologies being preached, music seemed like the perfect way to convey messages of freedom, as music was and remains a primary form of communication. There were two types of coded spirituals. Ones were called map songs, and the others were called signal songs. In a map song, the lyrics contained elements of a map that directed people to significant points of escape along the routes of the Underground Railroad. Wade in the water told the escaping slaves to get off the trail and into the water to make sure the dog slave catchers couldn't sniff out their trail. So people walking through water, they believed, did not leave a scent trail that dogs could follow. Wade in the water.